Hey guys, how you doing? This is JP Saricolia coming to you again to with another episode of Age of Heroes, my podcast. Welcome to the 25th episode of this podcast. And today I want to ask this question. I want to ask the question, why is it that video games are better than comics? I know this might sound a bit controversial, but let me explain. Let me go further into the reasons why asking this question. For the past couple of days, I've been talking about comics. I've been discussing, what's happening primarily with Marvel and the way they're changing some things around, changing some of the way they have been doing things for years, and why is it that it's hurting? How is it that the industry is hurting? But a lot of times people point out things that are happening in the entertainment medium, in the different sets of entertainment that we have nowadays are actually contributing or also diminishing the power of comics as a medium of entertainment. Some of that, of course, is television. Some of that is, of course, movies. Some of that, of course, is video games. Video games have become such a powerhouse. I'm an avid video gamer. I've been gaming for many, many years since I was a teenager. Well, since I was a kid. But I really got into video games heavily when I was a teenager. Actually, after I was actually coming out of comic books, I got into video games, and it was pretty much nonstop then. I got into video games and keep, using that as a medium back in the 90s as a way of entertainment that was actually superior to me than comic books. And of course, as I got older, I came back to comic books. I've taken breaks from comics from time to time and then come back again, because, it's something that I grew up as a child. But comic books have taken a big part of, pretty much my entertainment, of my life, or the things that I do as a hobby. And up to this day, it's one of my most passionate hobbies. Sometimes I think it's even superior to statue collecting or any other thing, because I love gaming. I love the ability to submerge myself into these stories and into these worlds and be able to be something. I would suppose we all want to be something that we're not. You become a soldier in a first-person shooter. You become a superhero in Arkham Asylum. You become one of these characters, in a different planet. You become like a Mars explorer. You become all of those things, and you're playing the part, versus a comic book story where you actually reading the story of someone else. Now, there are different ways of entertainment, and different approaches to entertainment. They're not the same. But they have the equal elements. They have elements that actually are important in any story. And the reason why, or what makes them equally powerful, would be storytelling. Storytelling is the most important element of any entertainment medium. It's the most important element of anything that you have, that everything that you present to the public for entertainment purposes. That goes for movies, television shows, anime, and that goes for video games, that goes for comics. It goes for everything. You have to have a good sense of storytelling. Storytelling is an important aspect of everything in life. As humans, we're storytellers. We love stories. The entirety of the world, books and novels and everything you see, it's all about storytelling. From the moment you see a commercial on TV, there's a story that is being told from the beginning to the end, and how you can entice a person through that story, how you can become a storyteller. And that's why you see nowadays a lot of podcasts like this podcast. And sometimes people say, what is the appeal of podcasts? And it's more about storytelling. It's about, how you present words, how do you express those words, and, the stories that you're sharing. People are listening. We love to hear stories. Bottom line, whether we watch something, whether there are visuals involved, it's all about story. And you see that time and time again. That's the important aspect of anything, of any entertainment medium. How can you entertain? How can you create a story that brings people in, that reels people in? It keeps them there, constantly watching, reading, listening, entertain, just with what you're saying. And that's something that is extremely important. And there is right there in that simple point, the difference between comic books and comics. Storytelling. The biggest problem that we have with comics today is the fact that the stories that are being told are not that great. From a storytelling standpoint, they are not enticing. They're not reeling people in because they miss some of those key elements that make any story great. And for that, we need to know, go back into really the important aspects, what makes a good story a good story. What makes a good story? There are elements that makes a good story. And that's the part where I can say about video games, where I feel that they are, have come into a much better conclusion and are building better stories. So let's explore those elements so we know exactly what you need. In order to make a dramatic content, to make a dramatic story very, very strong, there are elements that you have to consider. First of all, I'm going to count this 10. You need a conflict. Conflict is important. You have to create a situation, something, comic book stories, there's always a conflict. Of course, in video game stories, there's always a conflict. So that's an important part. Also, you have to have tension. The tension that is something is happening, a revolution is brewing, or a situation is causing trouble and problems between the characters. You have to have surprise. The element of surprise is important on anything. A story when it becomes predictable, when you know where the pattern is taken, then it becomes boring. And nobody wants to read something that is boring. You want to have that element of surprise, that every time you turn a page, there's something different, something new, a new development that is changing the course of the story. And, and that happens with video games as well. You need extraordinary characters or characters' behavior. You need, characters that are bigger than life. Characters are different. Characters that are enticing, alluring, and that's some of those elements that some of these characters are. Why we follow Superman? Why we follow Batman? Because they're alluring, because they're enticing. Why do we like people like, the guy from Uncharted? Because he's enticing, because he's lovable. Why do we love, Indiana Jones? Why do we love Darth Vader? Because they're different, because they're enticing. So you need those characters. You need controversy. Controversy is important. And that's something that I would say comics do a lot. They throw a lot of things for controversy just to keep you engaged, of course, because controversy is important. You have to make your readers and your viewers, think. To really consider those factors. And that's the reason why some games, like, for example, by Rockstar, like Red Dead Redemption series, or you see the Grand Theft Auto series, they're very controversial. There's a lot of things in there that you have an element of decision. You have to make a decision, whether it's bad or wrong. And that's going to create some controversy. There has to be mystery. Nobody wants to go and watch a series. You see those police, detective series where you already know the killer. That's one of the most, boring aspects of a series. If I can know exactly where we're heading, it's all matter of just going to see how they're going to kill the bad guy. You already know who the bad guy is. It's very boring. And that's something that I love about a lot of novels, British novels. And I love to really watch a lot of, mystery series, British, UK based mystery, TV series or like mini series, because there's always this idea, who is the one that did it? Who is the killer? Like reading a Sherlock Holmes book, who did it? You need to find out who did it. So you go through that mystery of discovering. It is important. There has to be that level. And that takes us to another step, which is suspense. You have to have a sense of suspense. Suspense is important in anything. What's going to happen next? What's going to happen in the next issue? What's going to happen in the next chapter? What's going to happen? And those are the elements that really create a dramatic story, and that's a lot of things that need to be done. Of course, one of the biggest problems also with comics is the wordiness of sometimes of comics, or the lack of words that really entice people to read more. That's the difference between good writers and bad writers. Good writers have a way to put words together that really, really, that are so lovable. that keep you just entertained. They keep you there sitting, wanting to read more because they're enticing you. Because the way that the process, the rhythm of the words is important. It's important for writers to create stories that are compelling in the reading part. Not just wordy, because, their writers are very wordy and they put all kind of stuff, meaningless stuff that doesn't matter. One of the greatest things that I love about Watchmen, for example, and I'm going to use to me what I consider the best comic book story of all times, just because the way it was crafted and put together, is how enticing the words. How compelling every single issue starts, every chapter, when it really, a play of words that really keep you there, because there's mystery, there is suspense in the words, but there is that, rhythm with words. So it is important to create stories that are simple, but they have this punchline that keeps people wanting to read more. You have to create believable and memorable characters. That's the important aspect. Without good characters, just no matter how you create the stories, the characters that are boring, that are plain, they're not going to get better. So you have to have this, intriguing goals and motivations. They have to have flaws and weaknesses. And that's the part with Marvel for so long was very, very, very good at it, because the situation was that the characters in Marvel they had flaws. They were human-like. And that was the comparison, the difference between them and DC. DC characters were, these big godlike figures that they were perfect, and Marvel create characters like Thor that he has flaws, the characters like Spider-Man that he's very insecure, and you see all this, but he wants to do the right thing. You saw characters like Wolverine that he has this anger built up inside, and all these things. So all these characters have these flaws that make him so touchable, so believable, but at the same time, they're bigger than life, because ultimately they make the last call to do what's right, regardless of the circumstances. That's what really stick about stories. Make those, it's important that you make every part of the story effective, and that's when you need great writers. Every part, every element, everything you tell in the story has to play a part. Don't just bring or create this, and that's something that happens even in comics. You see that a lot of new comics, there's a lot of parts that are not, gluing together. They're there, but they're just there for to be there, but they're not important. So you have to tighten the story to make it real, to stick, for people to care about it, because every part, sometimes less is more, and that's the biggest problem when you have all these big conflicts and, that we see nowadays, and these crossovers, when there's multiple characters, there's so many characters, you bring them all together, it really waters down the story. You have to concentrate into the main characters, those characters are important. When you see the V for Vendetta, you see V, V is the main character, and the person that is trapped there with him is the secondary character. There's not many characters in the story, but each character, each element, each word matters. So you have to really, really create that. Now, deepen the plots with the subplots. It's important to have subplots. The main plot, of course, is important, but create subplots around that kind of throw these red herrings that really put you in a different dimension. What is happening? How this is going to affect the main plot. But ultimately, every subplot has to really direct towards the main plot. It has to have a purpose there. And that's the thing with comic book stories that sometimes doesn't stick, is because there's so many different subplots that have no purpose there. They're just there maybe to point out to another issue of another comic book story. So, kind of like pushing you or to the side to buy another comic book story that's nothing to do with the story. Don't bring that in. And that's one of the biggest problems with comic book stories. I don't care if I'm reading a Batman story. If I want to concentrate on Batman story, don't throw at me, I don't know, a story for Batgirl that I don't care about, just to me to go and purchase another comic book for Batgirl, when I don't care about that, because that should be a self-contained story. Have self-contained stories. You have to do those things. Make every line of the dialogue count. Sometimes some of the best stories are when every line of dialogue has an impact. Sometimes there's a lot of superfluous things in comic book stories, and sometimes I see that, the characters nowadays where they talking about, they go into Starbucks or they want to drink their coffee and they talk about coffee or they talk about, I don't know, about online dating and things that had nothing to do with the story. If it's not going to count, if it's not going to bring effect to the story, then it's superfluous. Then it's meaningless. So just cut it out of the story, just cut it out of there and just concentrate on the story. This is the conflict that I'm paying attention. And that goes for novels, that goes for anything, even for movies. Sometimes, even I remember that some of the stories, initially when Netflix was creating their shows, the Marvel Netflix shows, they wanted to do 13 episodes, and they were kind of prolonging the episodes at first. Some of the shows, adding a lot of stuff, dialogue that was superfluous and meaningless and useless, just so they can accommodate 13 episodes. Ultimately, they reduced the episodes because they realized that people were bored. In the middle of the show, they were getting bored because of all the superfluous dialogues. Don't have that in comics, and unfortunately, you see that a lot in comics nowadays. Make an immersive setting, place a character. Make the place a character, an element, an important element of your story. And it changes with time. The story is, really affected by it. There's nothing more interesting when you see the stories when there is a creepy, background, and that's something that I would say for the longest. And one of the biggest ills of the 90s was that the main element of the drawing part, and this is where comic book stories, there's not only the writing part, but also the drawing go alongside. The 90s kind of injected this idea that everything has to be like a pin-up story. You see all this big muscular characters, scantily clad, ladies, coming to the fight, and all you see is their images, but the background is missing. It's not there. It's good in comic book stories, sometimes to have clean panels, but sometimes you need also that immersiveness of this. The place becomes an element of the story. That's one of the greatest things that I love about Watchmen, and I'm using Watchmen as an example of great storytelling. It's just how immersive, how the room, how the different places where they at, how New York City, how everything in the background is playing a big part on the story. Because those elements are bringing a big part of the story, are involved into the story. They become a character. Dark alleys full of, trash, the situation of the city, the immersiveness of the people walking on the street. All of that, is an important aspect. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the originals, even though it was black and white, the city had a persona, and that persona, it really moves the dialogue in the story. It really shapes the story. I remember some of my most famous, or not famous, but my most favorite Spider-Man stories have always been where actually New York City is in the backdrop as an important aspect of the city. The best Spider-Man stories is when you see the city involved in the story. That's what I really love the Netflix shows, particularly Daredevil, and all the Netflix shows, because New York City becomes an element. Hell's Kitchen, the Bronx, for Luke Cage, become an important aspect of of the story. They become a character themselves. They're involved with the story and the shots and everything. So there's something in comics that you have to do that. The elements, how to transition from one room to the other, how that changes the mood as well. We need that. If you do that, you create stories that are memorable. Create the conflict and create tension. Characters have conflict. Now, the conflict is important. It's not just the fights, because it seems that everything that happens in comics nowadays is a constant. They think that it has to be a fight where, the X-Men fighting the Avengers, and, every story has to have that, which is good. But conflict is more than just fighting, the punching people in the face. How many times, the Avengers and the X-Men have fought themselves, they're friends and foes, the assumption is that we have to do that. And sometimes even comic readers want that, but it's just constant repetition of the same thing. Sometimes conflict has to be internal conflict, personal division, all of that, character struggles, with elements, with decisions. You have to do that. The personalities need to clash. I think it's one of the great parts of where we love the X-Men, between the conflict between Cyclops and Wolverine, is because they're very, very different. They conflict, you see Wolverine, pretty much a very bad boy image. He wants to do his own thing. He let his emotion guide you. And then you see somebody that is pretty much a brainiac, as Cyclops. He wants to think through. He's more calm. And, but they both, clash in their decisions. Batman and Superman, they're opposites in many ways. They're friends. And one of the biggest parts with comics sometimes is the Marvel, no, DC, I'm sorry. It puts them in a level where they kind of like friends. They're friends, but sometimes they kind of agree with each other and all the things. And some of those comics are boring, to me. I like it when they differ in opinion. Those are the best comics. When Batman and Superman, they work together, but they differ. They have difference of opinion. They disagree with each other. Those create that tension in the middle of the stories. It really, this creates, the narrative, expands the narrative even more. You have to create that. You have to craft a bewilling beginning. You have to craft a good start on the story. Something that is enticing. There's nothing better. Like you see, for example, with Watchmen, that everything starts in a place where someone is dead, someone dies, and you try to figure out what's going on. It really hooks you up right away. You want to know more about the story. The story is important. The first page of a story, it really is impactful. And that's something, of course, that you see with, Jack Kirby for the longest. He had these big splash scenes. It starts with a conflict. And you're like, you go into the page and you see this big conflict with this superhero is standing on a defensive mode against some foes around them and things like that. This is a conflict right there. This is a beginning, a start where you really want to know more. What's going on? How he ended up there? How he ended up being, pursued by these people, how people are surrounding him. The stories are becoming like, there's nothing more boring than open a page and there's no explanation. There's no, like, a jumping into this scene. It's just like, we're going to have to go through that place. And nowadays, it seems like comics, it can take 1, 2, 3 issues until you get to an important part of the conflict. I want to be reeled in right away. It's important for comics to do that. You have to really ask this. You have to ask the questions. One of the best books is when you find someone is killed. Who is the killer? You need to find a killer. You have to start very, very strong. You have to start very rapidly into the story and you move forward. That's one of the reasons why I love, for example, The Court of Owls. I think it's one of the best stories for modern times. In recent years, it's because it starts with a conflict. Batman fighting, in Arkham Asylum, all these foes against him. The story, the art is great. Snyder does put a very good story, very concise, very great mystery there. It's not perfect by any means, but he does the job. And of course, Capullo does phenomenal with the art. He's just creating the backdrop of the story. So you have to do that. You have to have this, opening questions. You have to have this, characters doing unexpected things. Why they're doing what they're doing. That's how you hook your readers in. When you create those stories that are compelling, introduce those characters in very concrete terms, not just like, the things like sometimes those characters are introduced and meaningless. If the character introduced them that has a, really weight and they add weight to the conflict. Sometimes characters can be introduced in a way where you were not expecting them to be introduced. So, it is important that you do that you introduce each character in the moment that is most necessary. And that's something that happens sometimes. Stories, they bring all these characters into the fray that you have tens and tens of, tons of characters, but none of it has weight. Everybody is on the backdrop. Introduce them in the right moment, at the right time, when it's necessary. For example, when you create a story when the heroes are falling, the heroes are being, decimated by by their enemies, and all of a sudden they don't know how they can move forward. Then, of course, all of a sudden, at the end of the story, at the end of the issue, a hero comes forward. Someone comes to save the day. That's how you introduce that character. And the moment that you thought that everything was done and over, you introduced them. And of course, you move to the next issue. Now you have this tension. Now you have the question, what's going to happen next? So that's how you do it. You have to make a story a good ending. That's the part where I feel that a lot of comics don't do that because there's no longer an ending. There's not an open and shut case. It's more like we create a story and we just, stick with whatever. And at the end, there's no real ending. Real conclusion is just like technically an introduction to the next event or to the next story. That makes the stories really unappealing. And you're not resolving any conflicts there. You just simply extending the conflict to the next thing. And it's a constant vicious cycle when there's never an ending. And I said that before. And there is no climax. You have to build the rise in action. You have to build that action. You have to rise, you have to bring it to a boiling point where the climax comes, where the finality of the story comes. One of my favorite, video game stories of all time, where I felt that everything came to a great conclusion, was Mass Effect 2. I love Mass Effect. I've never been an RPG type of fan, but the first time I played Mass Effect, I got involved because the characters were enticing. They were different. Even they were not, similar. They were all together for one main purpose, but each character brought some weight to the story. You add these characters, you choose the path, you do what you want. You even choose who would live and who would die. But this character will bring something to the table. And so that you might not agree with their decisions, but they're all working together, building the story to come to a great finale. Because one of the greatest finales to me, Mass Effect 2 had a great finale. You saw the conflict. People live and people die based on that conflict. It was well built. And to this day, it really, really has always struck that light on me. The same that happens, I would say, with Red Dead Redemption 2. Always struck the light on me. You knew the conflict was boiling to the point that the finale was kind of expected, but at the same time, it was sad. He fighting for his life, just fighting for his life after he has done whatever he has done. All this are great, great stories. So you build that climax, that point of tension, complicate things, and ultimately, don't have a predictable ending. You have to have at the end of the story a sense that ending came about and it's done. And I think that's an important aspect. Some of the best comic book stories have that tension. I know some people say, but it's hard because you have this constant, they're constant creating more stories and stories and stories. And I know it's tough, but to be honest, the best way to do it is just conclude that story, that thread, and just wait for the next. That's what comics used to do it back in the day. You have a story and you have an ending. I remember, like the Batman, if you read like some of the early Batman stuff, like with Dennis O'Neil, he gotta, you may run for a few issues for the same story, 1, 2, or 3, but at the end of that story, it was over, and you move to the next thing. So the next issue, you start a new story, a new thread. And nowadays, it seems that there's never that stopping moment. It's just a constant continuity until the run runs out, until people get bored by the things, and then just reboot the whole thing again. They're not enticing people. That's the reason why you don't get to see nowadays like 100 and 300 or 400, 500 issues of one run. Everything seems to be just like 10 runs, 15 runs or less, and then they shut it down and restart again. So you want a conflict. You want something that is more permanent, but you have to create this series, within the stories, and you bring this into a conclusion. Why is it that comic books are doing it better? Video games are doing it better than comics, because they are attacking this situation. They are creating stories that are compelling to watch. My most favorite Batman story of recent times, I could say Court of Owls is one of them, but my most favorite, more memorable of recent years, for the last 10 years, I would say, or probably more than 10 years, but 10 years, has been in this case, the Arkham Asylum series. I love Batman Arkham Asylum. Arkham Asylum a lot of people love Arkham City, but the one that I loved the most was Arkham Asylum, because it was a self-contained story. He is trying to stop the Joker taking over Asylum, Arkham Asylum. Throughout that night, he has to take control of it. It's a self-contained story. There's a lot of elements. Each character was introduced. and brought something into the table, into that, what's happening. He has to stop him. There is tension. He doesn't have his weapons. He has to gain his weapons little by little. He has to move through the action. He had to stop every person. Every chapter has weight. There is tension. There is conflict. There is scenery. The Asylum also is a character in the story. There's not many characters, but the dialogues stick. The dialogues are important between him speaking to some of these villains. There's a dialogue that is important. Has all the elements of a great story. It's great storytelling. You watch it, you play it from beginning to end, and you feel that the end there is a real conclusion. So, of course, Arkham City expands on all of that. It's a more wider open situation, but there's so many different subplots. So it can get a little murky, and, yes, you can get bored after a while but the Asylum to me has always been the most self-contained of all of them. The best one. Ghostbusters story, the game was well put together. Self-contained story that has all the elements of a great game, and games like I say, like Mass Effect 2 have so many different subplots, so many different things. It's an RPG, but it keeps you entertained. There's tension. Who are the Reapers? Who are these people? Who are these villains? Who are them? What is it what they want? So you come to a conclusion in the end that really parts towards the third movie, but you have a happy conclusion at the end of the story. Red Dead Redemption, all these different games bring something to the table. And I think that's the element that we're missing with comic book stories. The lack of great storytelling. If Marvel, DC, or any other company are able to bring that together, put it together, they'll have great stories to tell. And they will create compelling comic book stories that people are willing to pay the hard-earned cash. It's not about the money. It's not only about how much they cost nowadays. It's about the stories. It's about how important they are and how well constructed they are. If you are not really writing stories that matter, if you're just doing stories just to sell more movie tickets, if you're creating stories just to become kind of like advertisement for those movies, then you are not doing anything. You're not doing yourself a favor. You're not doing anyone a favor. You're just killing the industry little by little because you are bringing stories that are meaningless, that have no purpose, that have no meaning, that have no weight. The narrative is poor. Everything is poor. The characters that are introduced are poor. They have no weight, they're gravitas. They have nothing there that really makes them memorable. And the stories need to be memorable. That's why some of the best stories of our time, they still remain the same stories of our time, Watchmen, and they still become, after so many years, you might think, somebody might create a story that is better than Watchmen, but nobody does. Why? Because nobody, everybody puts them in the first place. Nobody used them as an example. Nobody says, I can create a story. I believe that there are people out there that have better stories to tell than Watchmen, because ultimately Watchmen is a great story, but it has not the best ending in the world. It's not the perfect story. So I believe that there are the possibilities to have better stories than Watchmen, the V for Vendetta, that, the Dark Knight Returns, the Killing Joke. They are there, and sometimes these are overhyped because the truth of the matter is that, they haven't, or they don't give room to create better stories, and I believe that there are better characters to be written and better stories to be told. It depends on the willingness of these companies to really, take a wild guess, to really take a chance, give the opportunities to writers to create stories, to really put stories together that really matter. And that's why people are turning into video games. Because in video games, you're finding new stories, fresh new takes. There's controversy, there's different, makes you think things, characters that, are totally different than the characters that we already seen and read for many, many years. And they are fresh. And the stories are well put together. And it's not about just playing the game. It's about going through their stories and seeing their challenges and their conflicts. And also at the end, seeing them triumph or even lose. So create stories that really matter. That's my opinion. Of course, at the end of the day, this is their call, and they're going to do whatever they think is right, whether it's right or wrong. But of course, this is just my opinion. And I believe that if they're able to to change that, they will make more money. They will have gold treasure in their hands. Again, this is just my opinion. So what do you think? Do you think that storytelling matters for this? Do you think the storytelling combined, and we talk about storytelling combined with the art, all of it is part of the story. Do you think that is the element that the comic book companies need in order to improve their quality? Let me know. Just share your thoughts below. I would like to hear them. So once again, thanks for watching this video. If you're watching this through YouTube, thanks for listening to the podcast. Share your podcast with your friends. And please consider supporting this channel financially. You can do that to my Patreon account. So God bless you and have a happy weekend. I'll talk to you again. Bye-bye.